In 1946, the Skulls of Seven, led by the first Marshal of Westminster College, Charles Dog Lampkin, led the processional party, which included President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill, to this very podium for the green lecture that Churchill had entitled The Sinews of Peace. Today, the Skulls of Seven are honored to lead the processional for the Kemper Lecture on the historic occasion of the 50th anniversary of the National Churchill Museum. On behalf of Westminster College, I declare the Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture open. Please silence all cell phones. I now invite Mr. Bob Muehlhauser to the podium for the welcome.
Please sit. On behalf of the Board of Governors of the Association of Churchill Fellows and Dr. Fletcher Lampkin, the President of Westminster College, I welcome you to the Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lectureship, which was established in 1979. Before I go further, I'd like to introduce Lord Alan Watson, who has something special to share with us.
The point about this platform and this hall is that it has witnessed history and been part of history and remains part of historical memory. And it's for that reason that it is so good to be here for this celebratory luncheon today. I remember when I first came into this hall, which is now some years ago, I was somewhat taken by surprise. I don't know, somehow I thought it would have been made into, a sort of memorial of some kind. And I was very relieved to see the impedimenta of sports still around in the hall, fulfilling its original function. And I've always thought how very appropriate, but also startling it was that this location was chosen by Winston Churchill for such a momentous speech. And the agreement was of mutual satisfaction. This location gave Churchill what he wanted and needed in terms of being the sole national and international point of interest in the event. What he gave the university, of course, and this building was participation in the creation of a historical memory. And we celebrate both his speech and his memory, and I am very honored to be here this morning.
We'll all have the opportunity to hear from Andrew Roberts after lunch, but I want to mention that these Kemper lectures have continuously attracted global experts on both English history and Winston Churchill over these past 40 years. Most of these presentations are available on the museum's website, and I encourage you to go take a look at those, and short background pieces on the speakers today are on your programs. I am Bob Muehlhauser. I'm a member of the Board of Governors and a trustee of Westminster College. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm absolutely pleased to see all of you. We have people from across the United States, from several foreign countries. We're thrilled to have you with us. I know that you will agree that these kind of events don't just happen. It takes a whole lot of hard work from a lot of people, and I'm a big believer in saying thank you, so I'm going to do that. The tireless work of Philip Beckman, our Senior Fellow of the Board of Governors, Tim Riley, our Museum Director, members of the Board of Governors, Nancy Carver, Dick Mahoney, Von Brokaw, Suzanne Richardson. At least two of the college's Westminster trustees, Jim Bennett and Brock Ayers, members of the museum staff, Tyler Oberlag, Sam Craighead and Tom Pagano, and our crack Westminster team, led by Gina Campagna, Jenny Winnington, Jenny Leatherid, Rob Krause, and Cindy Lampkin. And then a big thank you to Mother Nature for blessing us with some sunshine. And Suzanne, where are you, Suzanne Richardson? Are you here, Suzanne? Good, just stand up for a second, please. She asked me to please not do this. Now, you all may not be able to see it, but the woman wears a cape. And all of the people that I just mentioned above, Suzanne, we thank you for your leadership, your energy, your passion, and most of all, the unbelievable commitment you make to the museum and to Westminster College. Thank you. For over 168 years, Westminster College has been a proud citizen of Fulton, Missouri, where we have always enjoyed a mutually supportive relationship with this small, high-performing city in the middle of these United States. Now I would like you to meet one of Fulton's most consistently impactful community leaders, the Mayor of Fulton, the Honorable Lowe Cannell.
Thank you. So, for those of you that don't know, I'm kind of brand new at this. I've been a month in, got elected about literally a month ago. So bear with me, I'll do my best. It's been sort of a whirlwind. We've had lots of events, meetings. I've been meeting lots of new people. I did get the chance to meet Tim Riley and his staff about 3 weeks ago. Great people. Tim's a great guy, wonderful speaker, and a great asset to the Churchill Memorial, the historic Churchill Memorial Museum. So with that, I was kind of thinking, as a local lifelong resident, we sort of take this for granted, the museum that we have here, but the historical significance of it, the tourism it brings in, we're thankful for it, and we will always cherish that relationship with the museum and also the college here, Westminster College and William Woods University, both. It's wonderful to have the culture and the education here. So one of the things I think about is the church itself. When I was in high school some 30 plus years ago, I was in the chamber singers. And one of the things we did during the holidays, we would always come out and perform. Part of that performance, we warmed up in the stairwell in the back of the church. So it's a big winding staircase, and we would go there and just line up those stairs. And it was so acoustically different and unique that it was kind of a moment for us to bond. And it's something that I'll never forget. But I'm just honored to be here for the 50th anniversary. Thank you for the opportunity to represent Fulton. If you do get a chance to see the city, tour it, we'd appreciate that. One thing to see is our new Nixon Forensic Center. It's going to replace the old Fulton State Hospital. That was a $220 million project that we're thankful that got done. And the building itself is really one of the most unique and weirdest looking things that you'll see. So if you get a chance, get on 5th Street and head east and just check it out. It's pretty cool. But other than that, just enjoy your time here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next, I'd like to introduce Bill Piper, a member of our Board of Governors who will offer the invocation.
Let's settle our hearts for just a moment in prayer, if you will. God of justice and mercy, thank you for the gift of life and the opportunity to serve. Help us to act with character and conviction. Help us to listen with understanding and goodwill. Help us to speak with charity and restraint. Give us a spirit of service. Remind us that we are stewards of your authority. Guide us to be leaders your people need. Help us see the humanity and dignity of those who disagree with us, and to treat all persons, no matter how weak or poor, with the reverence of your creation. And finally, renew us with the strength of your presence and the joy of helping to build a community worthy of the human person. We ask this as your sons and daughters, confident in your goodness and love. Amen.
And thank you, Bill, again for your generous and consistent support of the museum. Enjoy your lunch. Well, I hope everyone, hello? Tim? All right, let's see if we can continue with this important program. As I stated earlier, the Kemper Lectures have continuously attracted global experts in both British history, British American history, and Winston Churchill for over 40 years. For the last 20 or so, we've had the great pleasure of having these guest luminaries be introduced by someone who was well known for his great introductions. This man is a leading citizen in Kansas City and around the United States, someone who needs no introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you fellow Crosby Kemper.
So, fellow Muehlhauser, Marshal Jones, Mayor Cannell, Secretary Ashcroft, Senior Fellow Beckman, fellow fellows, members of the Churchill family, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. It's a thrill to have Andrew Roberts back. It's a thrill to be on this stage, which recreates the stage from which Winston Churchill gave the Sinews of Peace, the Iron Curtain speech. I assumed originally that we had moved from the church because I was going to tell some stories about Andrew that were inappropriate from the pulpit. But he's told me that I cannot tell those stories, though I think I will tell one, but in a moment. Winston Churchill achieved fame in many ways, but not least as a historian. His Nobel Prize for Literature was certainly about his great triumphs in the writing of history. They're still read by us, his history of the English-speaking peoples, the Second World War, and our speaker has revised and extended the first with his own history of the English-speaking peoples since 1900, and provided a brilliant variation on the theme of the second with his Storm of War and Masters and Commanders. Of course, it can't be said of Andrew Roberts what Arthur Balfour said of Churchill's history of the First World War, the world crisis, that it was an autobiography disguised as a history of the universe. But Andrew's histories and biographies share a relevance with Churchill's in providing a guide to the present and a sense of the character that is needed in our world to preserve the best for our future and for our children. I must also say there's no lack of Churchillian personal ambition in this. Andrew once said, boy, I hope, please God, that he remembers he said this to me many years ago, at least 15 years ago, that he thought, or it was part of his ambition to be the prettiest historian. Now, that has a wide array of connotations, I think, and his only rival, he said, could be Neil Ferguson. That may give you a sense of those connotations. And I would say that it is certainly true today that we now know that the beauties of his Napoleon, his Churchill, his histories of the Second World War, and his continued achievements in the sartorial have firmly established his preeminence. His genius, and I am serious about that. Oops. I have totally memorized, not to worry. His genius, and I'm serious about that, is to use Churchill as historian and biographer to provide a commentary, a running commentary on Churchill the man, Churchill the statesman, and in these unheroic times, Churchill the hero. Alexis de Tocqueville, in one of the most important, if less remarked upon, chapters of Democracy in America, writes of the characteristics of historians in democratic ages. The histories in aristocratic ages, he says, attribute occurrences to the will and temper of certain individuals, while the historians of a democratic age exhibit precisely the opposite characteristics. They are historians of great general causes, of systems. What we would today call the sociology of history, the general reasons operating on the many and the multitude. There is no question today that most historians would identify Churchill with the age of aristocracy, anachronistic, aristocratic, in need of revision. It is one of the achievements of Andrew Roberts in this magnificent biography that his understanding of Churchill as a descendant of Marlborough, an admirer of Burke, the defender of traditions, and of himself as the historian and soul of the British Empire, becomes a symbol for something much greater. There are two words in Churchill Walking with Destiny that recur again and again. The first is civilization, usually in the words of Churchill himself, giving us what Tocqueville would call the special influences of individuals. Over and over again, Churchill speaks of civilizations and in its defense. The critique of everything that comes from the past, from our traditions, that currently overloads our political and historical discussions, is confronted by this Churchill endlessly defending what is good about our traditions and our civilization. The second word, used once or twice by Churchill himself in the biography, but throughout the book by Andrew Roberts himself, is paladin. Paladin. Churchill is the paladin, the medieval knight-errant of our modern world, the individual challenging the systems, totalitarian, military, bureaucratic, sometimes quixotically, sometimes romantically, sometimes successfully, always nobly. This is a biography of a hero, but it is not only an aristocratic hero, but also a democratic hero, with all the contradictions, but without irony. Andrew Roberts first came to us as the biographer of Churchill's rival, Lord Halifax, and was the author of a series of brilliant biographical essays, Eminent Churchillians, that were themselves the beginning of a revision of the revisionist historians, and with this prize-winning and with his prize-winning biography of Lord Salisbury. He has inaugurated a new era in which we may come to see this as the classic age of biography. If, in the words of Winston Churchill himself, that the empire of the future is the empire of the mind, the great interpreter of the origins and foundations of that future in words like civilization and paladin will be our paladin of history, Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed, Crosby, for that complete stream of total invention. I'd like to preface my remarks by saying what an honour and a delight it is to speak in this historic hall. I believe that I'm only the second Crosby lecturer ever to be invited back. The first being Sir Martin Gilbert. And many of us who write about, it's said of scientists, of course, that they stand on the shoulders of giants, Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein and so on. With Churchill scholars, we are standing on the shoulders of Sir Martin Gilbert. He is the giant. And to be able to stand on here, to be able to come here where he has lectured twice is, as I say, a signal honour for me, and I hugely appreciate it. If Winston Churchill had not been a statesman, writer, and politician, he would have made a very good living as a stand-up comedian. As early as 1947, before he'd even become Prime Minister for the second time, wit and wisdom books of his best jokes and quips were already being published. He'd also become one of those lucky people to whom witticisms are attributed, whether he said them or not. a good deal of research has gone into finding out which witticisms Churchill did and didn't say, principally my friend Richard Langworth. And the result is that we now know that he has a body of well-attributed remarks that easily puts him on a par with his contemporary wits, such as Oscar Wilde, Hilaire Belloc, Dorothy Parker, A.P. Herbert and Noel Coward, added to which he also had the comic timing of Groucho Marx. Wit mattered highly to Churchill, and he turned it into a very effective weapon in his political armoury, to charm audiences, of course, but also to deflect criticism, ridicule opponents, and sometimes to calm situations that were getting fraught. He well understood the need to entertain his audiences if he was able also to instruct, persuade, and, especially in wartime, to inspire. His use of wit started early. When Mr. Mayo, his Harrow schoolteacher, said to Churchill's class, "I don't know what to do with you boys," Churchill shouted out, "Teach us." Asked in an interview in 1902 about the qualities desirable in a politician, Churchill said, "The ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and then to explain why it didn't." He could also quip of the job of an MP, "He's asked to stand, he wants to sit, and he's expected to lie." Many politicians of his time, indeed of our time too, would ponderously start their speeches with a set-piece joke to try and establish themselves as a normal human being, before getting down to the serious political part of their addresses. By total contrast, Churchill would often pepper his serious remarks with witty asides throughout his speeches, forcing his audiences to concentrate all the harder as he lightened and then darkened the tone at will. A.P. Herbert, another great parliamentary wit of the day, pointed out that words on the printed page could not wholly do Churchill's humour justice. Without some knowledge of the scene, the circumstances, the unique and vibrant voice, the pause, the chuckle, the mischievous and boyish twinkle on the face. Even in the darkest days of World War II, Churchill managed to inject humour into his speeches. Indeed, as I will argue, he did it especially during the darkest days of World War II, knowing how good it was for the British people to understand that their leader was not demoralised, but was instead capable of making jokes however dire the situation got. Indeed, the darker the situation, the funnier his jokes became. This would have been impossible in anyone who did not believe that he was walking with destiny. I'm sometimes asked why I subtitled my biography of him, Walking with Destiny. One friend of mine told me it was because all Americans are interested in destiny and all Englishmen are interested in walking. Churchill's immediate predecessors as Prime Minister, Andrew Bonar Law, Stanley Baldwin, Ramsay MacDonald, and Neville Chamberlain, rarely brought witty repartee into the chamber of the House of Commons, some because they were simply incapable of it, others because they thought it unbecoming. Again, by contrast, with Churchill, the expectation of a quotable witticism would fill up the House of Commons chamber as he rose to speak. He used his wit to encourage high attendances, both for his Commons orations and for his public speeches around the country. When he started out on his political career in the days before radio, people who came to his speeches would know that they would be the first in the pub or back at home to repeat the jokes that he'd made. Churchill honed his wit when he stood for Parliament no fewer than 7 times in the 11 years between 1899 and 1910, often by replying to hecklers on the election stump. Standing as a Liberal in the 1908 by-election, Churchill asked, he said to his audience, what would be the consequence if this seat were lost to Liberalism? Now, it's always a risk to ask a rhetorical question to a lively audience, because during the pause that must necessarily follow the question, so that the portent of it sinks in, someone might shout out something funny. Sure enough, on this occasion, when Churchill asked what would be the consequence if this seat were lost to Liberalism, a heckler shouted out, beer, because the Tories were always promising to cut the price of ale. That might be the cause, Churchill immediately replied. I'm talking of the consequence. Later on, another heckler yelled "rot" at one of his points. When my friend in the gallery says "rot," Churchill riposted, he's no doubt expressing very fully what he has in his mind. Such sallies were part of what people had come along for, and the word laughter appeared more than 40 times in the Times newspaper reporting of that meeting. I can assure you that the word laughter hardly ever appears in the reports of speeches by Andrew Bonar Law and Neville Chamberlain, let alone 40 times. The Times is speechless, Churchill also joked during that by-election, and takes 3 columns to express its speechlessness. Of the Liberal Party's support for Irish Home Rule, he said, and thousands of people who never under any circumstances voted Liberal before are saying that under no circumstances will they ever vote Liberal again. The art of the riposte was central to Churchill's fame as a public speaker, and it meant that few wanted to take him on. He was once called a dirty dog by a Labour MP, Sir William Paling, and Churchill reported, "May I remind the honourable member what dogs, dirty or otherwise, do to palings?" He enjoyed playing with the names of people, saying of an MP called Bossum that he was neither one thing nor the other. When he was told that General Plasterus, which all British generals pronounce plaster arse, had become Prime Minister of Greece, Churchill asked them, "But does he have feet of clay?" Actually, the King's private secretary, Tommy Lassell, said that he'd have sooner made that joke than written Gray's Elegy. The jokes were not always directed against people. When the man who was taking the photographs for Churchill's 75th birthday said, "I hope, sir, that I will shoot your picture on your 100th birthday," Churchill replied, "I don't see why not, young man. You look reasonably fit and healthy." Overall, of course, his witticisms, though, were directed against political opponents, which, of course, might also go some way to explain why he was so unpopular during the wilderness years. He spoke without a note, Churchill said of a Labour MP in 1930, and almost without a point. When a Tory MP left the Conservatives to stand as a Liberal, he described it as the only instance of a rat swimming toward a sinking ship. What forcibly struck me again and again while researching and writing my biography of Churchill was how constantly he made jokes throughout the worst crises that my country has ever faced, the worst perils, in 1940 and 1941 when the Nazis were threatening to invade my country. There was no moment so bad that he couldn't lighten the mood and improve the morale of everyone around him through the targeted deployment of humour. When he was at number 10, there was always laughter in the corridors, recalled his private secretary, Jock Colville, even in the darkest and most difficult times. Just after the Dunkirk evacuation, for example, when the head of the Royal Navy, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, brought Churchill the long list of all the ships sunk and damaged in the operation, Churchill told him, "As far as I can see, we only have the Victoria and Albert left." The Victoria and Albert, ladies and gentlemen, was the royal yacht. After the fall of Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg, when Colvin brought him a telegram whilst he was dressing for dinner, Churchill said, "Another bloody country gone west, I'll bet." 3 days before Paris fell, when at the crisis meeting at Brière, the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, asked Churchill what his defence plans were for the expected German invasion, Churchill replied, and this is the invasion of Britain, Churchill replied, "I haven't thought that out very carefully, but broadly speaking, I should propose to drown as many as possible of them on the way over, and then knock on the head anyone who managed to crawl ashore." He said this in his execrable French, frappé sur la tête, and sadly, very sadly, history does not relate the French reaction to such levity at a calamitous moment for the Allied forces. To maintain a sense of humour at such desperate times showed how effortlessly Churchill could lighten tension when needed. Fortunately, he'd left the conference before General Weygand predicted to Reynaud that within a month Britain would have her neck wrung like a chicken. In the same speech on the 4th of June 1940, in which he said that in 1,000 years men would still say that this was the Empire and Commonwealth's finest hour. Churchill made a joke about the Italian Navy, which had performed very badly in the First World War. There is a general curiosity in the British fleet, he said, to find out whether the Italians are up to the level they were in the last war, or whether they've fallen off at all. The writer, Peter Fleming, analysed why that particular joke went down so well with Parliament and the public. And he wrote, "If he had ended, or whether they're even worse, he would have scored a hit. But by employing a subtler twist of denigration, he gave to the passage that characteristic lilt of gaiety and evoked in his hearers the agreeable sensation of having been made privy to a personal code of humour." This personal code of humour, of course, had a side that some decried as heartless. On the 7th of August 1942, Lieutenant General William Gott had been shot down and killed in a plane in the Western Desert. That evening, when Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa, accused Churchill of not appealing enough to religious motives in politics, Churchill replied with mock indignation, "I've made more bishops than anyone since St. Augustine." It might have seemed insensitive to make a joke on such a sad day, but as he wrote years later of that day, "Who in war will not have his laugh amid the skulls?" If humour had been, I don't think he was referring to your skulls here, by the way. If humour had been considered unacceptable whenever there had been a tragic death in that war, Churchill would have made no jokes at all. And as one who had served in the trenches of the Great War and on 4 campaigns prior to that, he knew that humour, even in the worst times, has always been an invaluable part of soldiers' psychological armoury. Very many of Churchill's jokes were self-deprecating, as when, at a dangerous time for him, during a no-confidence motion in July 1942, he was attacked over the very serious shortcomings of the A-22 tank. As might be expected, he said it had many defects and teething troubles, and when these became apparent, the tank was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. Here, the key word that makes the joke work is the self-deprecating word appropriately. He knew and admitted that he had his own defects and teething troubles, and as a result, he won the sympathy and support of the House, where a less credible defence of the tank in question might not have got him that. Churchill's capacity for using humour to deflect criticism or to change the subject was to serve him well in the war years and beyond. There was a marvellous moment when, in 1943, when the War Cabinet was trying to decide its policy towards Turkey. They very much wanted to get Turkey into the war. Not a very successful policy, only owing to the fact that Turkey didn't actually declare war against Nazi Germany until March 1945. But nonetheless, all the way through the war, they were trying to get Turkey into the war. And Anthony Eden wanted to use the carrot, and Winston Churchill very much wanted to use the stick. And at one point, as the argument was getting quite violent, Winston Churchill, and this was in the November of 1943, said to Eden, who was just about to go off to Ankara to negotiate with the Turks, he said, "Tell Turkey that Christmas is coming." The flight of Rudolf Hess to Scotland in May 1941 gave Churchill some opportunities for joking, even though it was a very serious moment in the war. Indeed, Hess had landed on the same day that the chamber of the House of Commons had been destroyed in an air raid. He was amused that when the Duke of Hamilton, and of course it was the Duke of Hamilton's estate that Hess was trying to fly to, Duke of Hamilton told him that the Deputy Führer had chosen to fly to that estate in Scotland because Hamilton was Lord Steward of His Majesty's household. Hess had taken it to be a real rather than an honorific title, and therefore would be able to urge his peace message upon the King, who Hess had wrongly thought might be in favour of the idea. "I suppose he thinks that the Duke carves the chicken," Churchill joked to his entourage, and consults the King as to whether he likes breast or leg. The consequences were not so humorous, of course. Churchill didn't want anyone in Britain, America, or Russia suspecting that he or his government was interested in peace negotiations. At lunch, explaining the whole bizarre story to the king, Churchill joked that he would be very angry if Beaverbrook or Anthony Eden suddenly left here and flew off to Germany without warning. Churchill would not mind waiting for the perfect opportunity, and sometimes waiting for years for the perfect opportunity to make a joke. After one of the budget speeches in the 1920s, Lord Monsell congratulated him on a crushing retort and asked him how he did it. "Bobby, it's patience," Churchill explained. "I've waited 2 years to get that one off." His mastery of what one could get away with saying in the chamber, and his sense of comic timing, evident when he told the Labour Party who were barracking him, "Of course, it's perfectly possible for honourable members to prevent my speaking, and of course, I do not want to cast my pearls before those who do not want them." The word swine to describe one's political opponents was, of course, banned under the parliamentary rule book. On that occasion, Labour members laughed for such a long time after that joke that when the debate was resumed, they'd quite forgotten why they were barracking him in the first place. Budget speeches were, and indeed still are, typically very boring in British politics, being all about finance. But in a typically Churchillian way, he turned them into spectacles, so much that the galleries were packed during his budgets, and even the Prince of Wales came to one, turning it into a fashionable occasion in society. In the budget debate in April 1931, when some MPs on the other side of the House complimented him on his chancellorship, he replied, "I suppose a favourable verdict is always to be valued, even if it comes from an unjust judge or a nobbled umpire." When he said in another debate, "We've all heard how Dr. Guillotine was executed by the instrument that he invented," and Sir Herbert Samuel shouted out, "He was not," Churchill replied, "Well, he ought to have been." There are certain topics during World War II on which he taught his listeners to expect jokes, which included his own loquacity, his appalling French, and any mention of Benito Mussolini. He once said of Charles de Gaulle that, "Now that the general speaks English so well, he understands my French perfectly." His description of Charles de Gaulle as being like a llama surprised in her bath is principally funny, I think, because he made the llama feminine. I, of course, am exceedingly pro-French, he once told his entourage. Unfortunately, the French are exceedingly pro-voking. When, on another occasion, his friend Brendan Bracken said that de Gaulle regarded himself as the reincarnation of Joan of Arc, Churchill growled, "Yes, but my bishops won't burn him." Sadly, though, he did not say the heaviest cross I've had to bear is the cross of Lorraine, which was actually said by General Louis Spears, the British representative to the Free French. From Wildian quips to English high irony to ruthless ridicule, Churchill's capacity to joke was a powerful weapon that he deployed very regularly. He rarely resorted to set-piece gags, much preferring to riff off any situation he found himself. But an exception came during a period of heavy criticism after defeats in the Western Desert in late 1941, when he joked how there was a custom in Imperial China that anyone who wished to criticize the government had the right to, and, provided he followed that up by committing suicide, very great respect was paid to his words, and no ulterior motive was assigned. That seems to me, he said, to have been, from many points of view, a wise custom, but I certainly would be the last to suggest that it should be made retrospective. Churchill deployed understatement to excellent effect, especially if his listeners were expecting something portentous. In February 1943, he read out General Harold Alexander's splendid message that His Majesty's enemies, together with their impedimenta, have been completely eliminated from Egypt, Cyrenaica, Libya, and Tripolitania. I now await your further instructions. Churchill, telling the House of Commons this, then added, "Well, obviously, we shall have to think of something else." When Churchill's valet, Frank Sawyers, accompanied him on a flight from Algiers to England in February 1943, he said to him, "You're sitting on your hot water bottle. That isn't at all a good idea." "Idea," replied the Prime Minister. "It isn't an idea, it's a coincidence." Later on that year, on the way to Roosevelt's residence at Hyde Park, Churchill and his daughter Mary visited the Niagara Falls, which he'd last seen in 1900. "Do they look the same?" asked a not particularly bright journalist. Whereupon Churchill replied, "Well, the principle seems the same. The water still keeps falling over." Of course, Churchill's detractors, unable to match him in wit, tried to use his sense of humour against him, implying that his jokes meant that he was not a wholly serious politician. Many are the letters and diary entries that echoed Neville Chamberlain's complaint to Lord Halifax of August 1926. "His speeches are extraordinarily brilliant, and men flock in to hear him as they would to a first-class entertainment at a theatre. The best show in London, they say, and there's the weak point. So far as I can judge, they think of it as a show, and they're not prepared at present to trust his character and still less his judgment." There was a political price that Churchill had to pay in having a sense of humour. Someone that funny, Chamberlain was implying, could not also have good judgment. On D-Day, over 160,000 men landed in Normandy in 24 hours, parachuted from planes and landing on the 5 invasion beaches. Although there were over 8,000 casualties that day, of whom around 3,000 were killed, this was at the lowest end of the spectrum of what had been feared. Yet for all these grim thoughts, Churchill never lost his sense of humour. When an MP asked him on June the 8th, D-Day +2, to promise the House that he would ensure that the same mistakes were not made after victory in the Second World War that had been made after the First, the Prime Minister replied, "That is most fully in our minds. I am sure that the mistakes of that time will not be repeated. We shall probably make another set of mistakes." On the afternoon of the 1st of May 1945, the day after Hitler's death, the Commons chamber was full of MPs expecting the announcement of victory in Europe. "I have no special statement to make about the war position in Europe," Churchill said, "except that it is definitely more satisfactory than it was this time 5 years ago." As well as understatement, English high irony was another favourite genre of Churchillian humour. On the 20th of July 1944, a small group of German generals tried to kill Hitler in his East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfschanze. And on the 2nd of August, Churchill joked of what he called Corporal Hitler. "Even military idiots find it difficult not to see some faults in some of his actions. Altogether, I think it's much better to let officers rise up in the proper way." The next month, asked to give the House of Commons a categorical denunciation of the Prime Minister of the collaborationist Vichy regime, Pierre Laval, Churchill replied, "I'm afraid I've rather exhausted the possibilities of the English language." As well as Britain's enemies, Churchill also ridiculed his own political opponents relentlessly. A favourite butt was Aneurin Bevan, the Labour MP for Ebbw Vale, who kept demanding Churchill's resignation during the war, and after it he said that Tories were, quote, "lower than vermin," unquote. On the issue of Britain finally recognising Red China diplomatically in July 1952, Churchill said, "If you recognise anyone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you like him. We all, for instance, recognise the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Ebbw Vale." Churchill was particularly good at puncturing the pomposity of oleaginous MPs. When, during Prime Minister's questions, one Tory MP suggested that the House should toast "Death to all dictators and long life to all liberators, among whom the Prime Minister is the first," Churchill phlegmatically replied, "It's very early in the morning." When a famously long-winded MP called for a national day of prayer and asked, "Will the Prime Minister assure the House that while we have quite properly attended to the physical needs of defence and of our other problems, we should not forget those spiritual resources which have inspired this country in the past and without which the noblest civilization would decay?" Churchill replied, "I hardly think that that's my exclusive responsibility." When he used the Latin expression primus inter pares, first amongst equals, and Labour MPs shouted, "Translate," Churchill said, Certainly I shall translate, for the benefit of any old Etonians present. Returning to the opposition benches in 1945, for the first time in 14 years, Churchill had endless opportunities to use his humour to criticise the Attlee government, which he used unsparingly. On occasion, he came, however, to his opponent Clement Attlee's defence, as when Stalin accused Attlee of being a warmonger over the Korean War and rearmament. Churchill retorted that, as Labour was intending to call him, Churchill, a warmonger in the next election, Stalin has therefore been guilty not only of an untruth, but also of infringement of copyright. The time of this speech has come, I'm afraid, that when, with a heavy heart, I must disappoint a large number of you by telling you some of the very large number of very good and funny jokes that Churchill did not say. Richard Langworth has trawled all the sources long and hard, as have I, and in a chapter entitled Red Herrings in his book, Churchill in his own words, he lays out 10 pages of false attributions. Richard and almost all other Churchill scholars have not been, no Churchill scholar has been able to find the moment when Churchill told Lady Astor or anybody else that if he were married to her and she poisoned his coffee, then he would drink it. Nor did he say that if you're going through hell, keep going. He never mentioned, called Clement Attlee a sheep in sheep's clothing, nor did he say an empty car drew up and Clement Attlee got out. He never said that Britain and America are two nations divided by a common language, or I know of no case where a man added to his dignity by standing on it, or a fanatic is someone who won't change his mind and won't change the subject. It's a great shame that among the red herrings that Churchill's, one of my favourite Churchill stories, I can't remember whether I told it last night. Did I tell the Ribbentrop story last night? No, okay, good. I'll tell you it now, but as I say, I'm afraid it lives in the Apocrypha rather than in the actual text itself. Was when the Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister in London, when he was ambassador to London, warned Churchill that in the next war, Italy was going to be on the side of the Third Reich. And Churchill replied, well, it seems only fair. We had to have them last time. As a drinker, smoker, and carnivore, outliving teetotalers and vegetarians never failed to give Churchill huge satisfaction. As he said, I get my exercise as a pallbearer to my many friends who exercised all their lives. Some decried Churchill's use of humour as flippant, others as a cynical weapon to win popularity and deflect legitimate criticism. But it also reflected his extraordinary coolness under pressure, as well as his refusal to be cast down and his belief in the necessity of maintaining morale. It came, as I say, I believe, from his true sense of his own private and personal destiny. He was an epigrammatist to rival Samuel Johnson and Sidney Smith. But unlike those two, he was witty while also saving his country during a world war. On Churchill's death in January 1965, Clement Attlee said, I recall the long days through the war, the long days and long nights, in which his spirit never failed, and how often he lightened our labours by that vivid humour, those wonderful remarks he would make, which absolutely dissolved us all in laughter, however tired we were. Ladies and gentlemen, Winston Churchill might have offered his country nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but they weren't all tears of pain and loss. Sometimes, when they were least expected but also most needed, they were tears of laughter too. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andrew. As you rightly noted, you are only the second historian or distinguished guest to give the Kemper Lecture twice. I think you may be the first to give it thrice. Thank you. You're welcome back. I think as we reflect upon the history of America's National Churchill Museum and the 50th anniversary we celebrate here today, I'm reminded on a daily basis that one of our charges here at Westminster College in this historic place is to preserve and promote artifacts, letters, paintings, speeches that were associated with Winston Churchill, his life, and his times. It's also part of our charge and duty to preserve and protect the largest work in our collection, St. Mary the Virgin Aldermanbury, the model of which stands in the gymnasium here today. That's the original model that was at the groundbreaking in 1964, designed by Hallmark, and one of the Wren stones that was moved from London to Fulton but not used in the reconstruction. I invite you all to look at it more closely. These objects are eyewitnesses to history. They inform and they inspire us every day. And in increasing numbers, they inform and inspire visitors. I'm happy to say in the last 2 years, our visitorship here is up 27%. It's proof positive that Winston Churchill still has things to say. His words from this historic lectern resound still in this space and beyond. But in addition to objects and spaces, there are people that help tell the story. Historians like Andrew, thank you. Family members, Edwina, Emma Soames, Jack Churchill, Duncan Sands, thank you for being here and sharing your stories of your family's terrific legacy. But there are a couple of other individuals I'd like to recognize too who are eyewitnesses to history. First, talked about the church. It was a monumental undertaking to bring that church from London to Fulton. Sir Christopher Wren is the architect of record. It was a great sign in the 60s when the church was being built, a construction sign that said, honorary committee, Jack Kennedy, honorary committee, Harry Truman, people who helped make this happen. And on top it said, architect Christopher Wren. Another gentleman whose name was on that list was St. Louis-based architect Frederick Sternberg. And two of his daughters have joined us today from different parts of the country, Betsy Kanaga and Linda Shirk. I know you're here. Thank you for being with us, and we thank your father for his role in the establishment of the memorial. We also have with us a gentleman whose grandfather arguably started it all here at Westminster College with that typewritten letter sent in the winter of 1945 from Westminster College in Fulton to Winston Churchill, inviting him to come and speak here. That was Westminster College President Frank McClure. His grandson, Richmond McClure, is here today. Richmond? And finally, last night we were able to meet and hear from Captain Mort Harris. Mort, we're glad you're with us again today. Thank you for your tremendous service in the Second World War for our country. For those of you who weren't with us last night, Mort Harris flew 33 combat missions over France and Germany and Europe and did some tremendous work during the war. We're glad you're here today. It was an honor, sir, to show you through the museum. Mort, thank you. And finally, on the subjects of eyewitnesses of history, we have three individuals here, today, who are returning to Westminster College in Fulton, just as they did on March 5th, 1946, when they were here to hear Winston Churchill and Harry Truman from this stage. They are, first of all, Earl Harbison from St. Louis. Earl, are you with us? There he is. Welcome back, Earl. Now, I'll tell you a very, very quick story. Earl did not have a ticket to get into the gymnasium that day, and he heard the speech from the loudspeakers outside. Am I correct? I'm glad you're inside today. The other two gentlemen who did make it into the gymnasium and are back here with us today, Rob Lindemeyer. Rob, are you here? Westminster alumnus. Welcome back. Oh, he was outside too. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you made it in this time. And of course, one gentleman who I know for certain was inside the gymnasium. He was a member of the Skulls of Seven. We saw the processional. He led the processional, led President Truman and Harry Truman to the stage. And we're pleased to welcome him back, Baxter Watson. Baxter. He's here somewhere. Thank you, Baxter. So these individuals, like all of you, are eyewitnesses to history and help support and sustain our mission and purpose. Without you, we couldn't do what we do. And we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you for helping us commemorate, helping us celebrate, and relish in all things Churchill. We've got work ahead in the next 50 years. But I know together we will, as Churchill said from this space in 1946, take the high roads of the future. With that, I thank you. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. In about a little under a half hour at 2:30, we will begin a parade in downtown Fulton. I invite you to participate, to watch that great parade. We have some of the same units who were here in the dedication, some of the same units marching the parade who were here in 1946. It will be a great day to be in Fulton. Once again, thank you.
This fine institution. Whereas both the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Aldermanbury in Fulton, Missouri, and the museum in its Undercroft form, America's National Churchill Museum, the only organization recognized by Congress as America's permanent tribute to Winston Churchill. And whereas America's National Churchill Museum is both the living history and direct representation of the life of Winston Churchill and the beginning of the Cold War. And whereas the museum's breakthrough sculpture by Edwina Sandys, granddaughter of Winston Churchill, includes a portion of the Berlin Wall that signifies the end of the Cold War. And whereas former President Harry Truman invited Winston Churchill to give his famous speech on the campus of a college in Truman's home state of Missouri. And whereas, there's an awful lot to talk about what happened here because of your ancestor, Edwina. Whereas the 17th century church is the stunning and monumental memorial to Winston Churchill and his Sinews of Peace Iron Curtain speech made on the campus of Westminster College in 1946. And whereas America's National Churchill Museum is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the rededication of the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Aldermanbury in Fulton, Missouri, and is the only British heritage church in the United States physically relocated from the City of London to its new home on American soil. Whereas the museum provides an innovative and interactive opportunity for visitors to experience the life, leadership, and legacy of Winston Churchill. Therefore, it is now proclaimed that May 7th, 2019, to be Sir Winston Churchill Day in Missouri.
Thank you very much. We will place this with pride in the museum later this afternoon. May 7th is the actual 50th anniversary date, and we very much appreciate that. So everyone, happy anniversary.